Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, Stephanie Desmon talks to Johns Hopkins vaccine expert Anna Durbin about the evolving science behind a Lyme disease vaccine, which has not yet been approved, and what it could mean as tick season ramps up. They'll explore what's changed since earlier vaccines, where the latest research stands, and what you need to know in the meantime. Let's listen. Anna Durbin, thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, as always, Stephanie.
Today, I want to talk about a Lyme disease vaccine. Why now? What's changed?
Well, there was a vaccine several years ago that the manufacturer took off the market because of concern about lawsuits. And it had to do with some concern that a side effect of the vaccine may cause arthritis similar to Lyme disease. Now, that wasn't seen, for instance, in the clinical trials, but there was some concern because the vaccine was comprised of a protein from the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, and Lyme disease can cause arthritis. So there was some concern that the immune response to the vaccine could cause arthritis, although it was not seen in the clinical trials. But unfortunately, there were many law firms that were lining up for action, so the manufacturer pulled the vaccine. This is sort of what I would call a second-generation vaccine, and it was designed to remove parts of the protein that is responsible for arthritis. So from that instance, it's removed that part of the protein, which should result in no cause for concern about arthritis, and there were no cases or signs or symptoms of anything like that in the clinical trials. This is, I would say, a more acceptable version of the vaccine. As I said, it's the second generation. It covers a few different strains of the bacteria. There's a Lyme disease in Europe and a Lyme disease in the US, and they're caused by slightly different sort of cousins of the same bacterial species, is how I would phrase it. And this vaccine covers both the causes of Lyme disease in Europe as well as in the US. It has proteins from both. It was engineered to ensure that there wouldn't be any cause for concern of arthritis in this iteration of the vaccine. Now, Lyme disease is the most common tick-borne disease, both in the United States and Europe. It has great, what we call morbidity, meaning it causes a lot of side effects. A lot of people are affected, particularly, in areas of the northeast of the United States, around Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, down the whole mid-Atlantic coast, also out in parts of the Midwest, as well as where we see most of the cases of Lyme disease. And it can cause chronic illness. It can cause arthritis. It can cause, in its late stage disease, chronic arthritis, which can be difficult to control. Most people are familiar with early Lyme disease, where you get that bullseye rash that we've seen. And, when it's treated, presentation, it's very highly successful antibiotic treatment. There are some cases of what we call post-treatment Lyme disease, which we think can occur anywhere from, very low percentage, close to 0%, up to 30% of people who have Lyme disease. We don't have really good numbers on that, but we do know that it can occur. And that's what some people get concerned about with Lyme disease, is they're going to continue to have symptoms after they've been treated for Lyme disease. It is a disease that causes a lot of morbidity in people, and people are concerned about it as we come into tick season. Especially, people get very, very concerned about Lyme disease. And a Lyme vaccine would have a lot of benefit to people if it's licensed. And I think particularly, as I said, in those areas of high incidence in the United States and Europe, it would be really helpful in the prevention of Lyme disease.
Given that Lyme is transmitted by ticks, how does a Lyme vaccine work? Do we vaccinate the ticks?
We don't. So it's a bacteria within the ticks.
Mm-hmm.
So the ticks carry this bacteria. When they feed on humans, those bacteria get transmitted into the blood of humans. And so what a vaccine does, it builds antibodies against that bacteria to prevent that bacteria from causing problems once it's in the bloodstream of people. So it really is sort of a point of introduction, I would say, vaccines. We know that the tick needs to attach probably for about 24 hours to transmit Lyme disease. If you have antibodies against that bacteria already present, the goal would be to what we would say prevent infection. So don't allow any of those bacteria to survive and cause infection. We do know that the vaccine, this is a difficult bacteria to develop a good immune response against. And so it does take several doses of the vaccine over the course of a year to get enough antibodies to prevent disease. And whether or not, it was studied, we don't have data for years and years and years. So we don't know if we would have to give frequent booster doses or not to keep those antibody titers high enough. But if we can reduce the incidence of Lyme disease and certainly the morbidity, it would be a great benefit to people living in these areas that are endemic for Lyme disease.
If more people were vaccinated, would that make it more difficult to spread the disease and perhaps maybe the ticks wouldn't carry as much?
Well, unfortunately, humans are what we call a dead-end host. Anyhow, so we have these cute little mice, and it's really out in nature where we have deer. You probably heard it, deer tick and that sort of thing. So it's a cycle that a vaccine certainly vaccinating people won't get rid of Lyme disease because it goes from mice to deer and different mammals outside of humans. So vaccinating humans, unfortunately, won't get rid of the bacteria completely, which is unfortunate. But, people have talked about that. What if we vaccinate all the little mice out there that are really the host? That's the true host or reservoir of Lyme disease. The problem is mice don't live very long and they're hard to find. And how would you vaccinate all these mice? And then you would have to keep vaccinating them year after year after year. So it's really not a feasible strategy, something that we could do, unfortunately.
Where are we in the development process for this vaccine and what still needs to happen before people could access it?
Well, they just released the results of the phase 3 clinical trial. They did not meet their primary endpoint. So what does that mean? That means they set up that they needed to have a certain 70% efficacy, and then we have confidence intervals, meaning, it could go as low. We say we have 70% efficacy, but we had a range from, I'll just say, 50% to 90%. They did not meet it, what we call that lower bound. And the primary reason for that is the study didn't have enough people enrolled in it. And that is the unfortunate statement about this. So the primary endpoint, I believe, was Lyme disease starting 28 days after the last dose of vaccine. And they didn't meet that lower end of the confidence interval for that primary endpoint. The secondary endpoint was prevention of Lyme disease anytime post that last vaccination. They did meet that secondary endpoint. So they saw a statistically significant efficacy meeting their pre-specified criteria for the secondary endpoint, which is promising. Unfortunately, as I said, the trial didn't enroll enough people. It is unfortunate. These trials are very expensive to do. They did have some problems when they first started enrollment. Some of the sites they found out weren't really the highest quality, and so they had to throw the data out from all of those sites, and they had to sort of start over. Vaccine trials are very expensive, and the question is going to be, where do we go from here? So will this vaccine get licensed based on this trial, or will they have to do additional trials because they didn't meet the primary endpoint? And I think that's a question mark. 70% efficacy against Lyme disease is very good. But when you're in a clinical trial, that's where you have the best compliance, right? So, that means you have to get multiple vaccines over the course of a year. Would we see effectiveness that high? Will people be willing to go back? And those are things that we have to take into consideration as well. I think, to be perfectly honest with you, unvarnished opinion here, with the current state of the FDA and vaccines and sort of, I think it's difficult to know what's going to happen. And I think It's a very expensive investment by the company with an FDA that has caused a lot of uncertainty in recent years. We think of the Moderna trial where they didn't accept the data that Moderna put for another vaccine, even though they had worked with Moderna to say, this is how the trial is going to be done, this is what we want. And they later then did accept it after there was public outcry in the press and things like that. But there's a lot of uncertainty in how this current administration is regulating vaccines and their attitude toward vaccines. We want to make sure that when a vaccine is licensed, we have adequate safety data. We have confidence in the process of how the vaccine trial was done. We have confidence in the results, and we have confidence in the recommendations that were made. Because the vaccine did not meet its primary endpoint, it's unclear now what the next step would be. I do think that it's unfortunate that the trial didn't enroll the number of people that were necessary for that. And I think that's something that, the company really needs to think about as they're planning future trials, if they plan future trials.
Does this feel like a dead end, or does it feel like we're getting somewhere?
I definitely think we're getting somewhere. This vaccine performed, in my opinion, very well, given the small sample size, given the small size of the trial. From a product standpoint, from a vaccine standpoint, it induces good immunogenicity. But I think to gain confidence from the population, you have to, you really have to show that the vaccine is safe. You have to show that it's efficacious. And that's why the planning of your trial is very, very important. And it is expensive, but when you don't sufficiently power your study with enough volunteers, something like this can happen. And now you're sort of in a gray area. You have evidence that it worked, but you didn't meet your primary endpoint. You met your secondary endpoint, which is promising. But where do you go from here? I think that's going to be continued discussions with the FDA to say, what's next? Do we get limited licensure and then we do larger post-licensure studies to really confirm that the vaccine worked, that it was safe and that it worked? Or does FDA say you have to go back and you have to do a larger study or, to show that your primary endpoint can be met? I think those are questions up in the air, and we really don't know the answer to that. I'm sure that the company is in discussions with FDA right now about what their next steps are. I do think it is a promising step. I think it's a step forward. I think the vaccine shows promise. But again, we need to make sure that people have confidence in the vaccine and in the safety of the vaccine, as well as in the efficacy of the vaccine for it to be accepted.
What should people be doing now in the meantime?
Well, I always say, even if this vaccine were licensed tomorrow and you went out and you got this vaccine, I would say to you, you still need to protect yourself against ticks because these ticks spread other diseases that are quite serious. There's Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, Babesia, all of these things that a tick that has Lyme disease, the bacteria for Lyme disease, can have these other bacteria as well. So you should always protect yourself against ticks. And the best way to do that is to wear long sleeves, long pants, treat your clothing with permethine, and that can last several washings. You want to spray DEET on you to prevent tick bites as well as mosquito bites. You want to do tick checks when you go outdoors. I just learned this term when I was talking with some people who are working with Lyme disease and the Borrelia. It's tick questing season. This is where now the height of the tick biting comes. It's the nymph that is the smallest, little small tick that bites you. That's questing now, meaning that they're coming out of their cycle where they go from larvae to nymph. And in the spring is when we see so many of these ticks biting. So if you're in long grass, if you're in the woods, if you have pets that can bring ticks in, you do want to do a tick check of your kids, of yourself. Get somebody to look at your back if you can't look at your back, because you may not feel these ticks at all. So you do want to make sure that you protect yourself by wearing appropriate clothing, by using DEET, by doing tick checks every single day to prevent tick bites.
I feel like maybe I should stay inside.
Except it's so beautiful out. No, you just have to be careful, use your head and that sort of thing. I was talking with a faculty member here at the school who lives on Martha's Vineyard, and they have so much Lyme disease on Martha's Vineyard. And, they have protocols everywhere about tick prevention, preventing tick bites, doing tick checks, all of that. You just have to be aware is really the most important thing.
Anna Durbin, thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmon, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.